Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're joined by Josh Bressers. Josh, thanks for being here.
I am ecstatic to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely. We're really excited to chat with you. For folks that don't know you, maybe haven't listened to your few hundred episodes you have yourself, do you mind telling us a bit about your background and what you're up to these days?
I would love to. So my name is Josh Bressers. I'm the Vice President of Security at a company called Anchor. We do supply chain security. Our open source tools, some people might have heard of, are called Sift and Gripe. And then we obviously have an enterprise offering as well. And I've been in open source for, geez Louise, it's been more than 20 years now. It's been a really, really long time. I spent time at Red Hat and Elastic before that. And then I have two podcasts I do. There's the Open Source Security podcast, which obviously is open source security themed. And then I have a second one that's newer. It's a little over a year, called Hacker History. And that one's a lot of fun with the crew at the CypherCon security conference. I basically just sit down with people and say, tell me your hacker story. And then we learn about people's origins, and it's a ton of fun, and I truly enjoy it. But yeah, it's kind of live and breathe open source and supply chain and security. And I love it all. It's so much fun.
Yeah, it's awesome. You have a depth of experience in this podcasting realm that we haven't even scratched the surface of yet. I'm excited to have you on.
Awesome.
And you also mentioned your 20 years of background of being in open source software, for example. And you actually wrote an article about the software supply chain recently and why it's starting to get so much attention. Yeah, I wanted to ask, 20 years into this, what do you think has changed that's all of a sudden open source software and software supply chain security is now a forefront of conversation?
Everything has changed. So, I mean, if we look back 20 years, I remember when I got into open source, I had people like sit me down when I was young, I was in my 20s, and say, like, you are throwing your life away with this crap. Don't do this. Like, you're smart. You have a bright future ahead of you. Like, Microsoft is the future. It's where it's at. And of course, I'm young and rebellious. I'm like, no, Microsoft is terrible, and there's no way they're going to win. And ironically, I don't think I'd say they won. They just became part of open source, which who says who won that one? But but anyway, and way back in those days, I think there was a definite hostility towards open source, and there was a lot of unknowns. And then we kind of fast forward, a decade or more, and people are starting to use open source, right? It's almost everywhere. Like, I'm at Red Hat, it's replacing Unix. Everyone's starting to use it, but I don't think a lot of people understood what that meant or how it was working necessarily. But then I think Log4Shell is kind of the tipping point where this enormous security event happens and everyone says, are we running this thing? And they start looking, and I think they were like, holy crap, there's open source everywhere. And I mean, there was a lot of Log4j as well, they found, but I think that's what really opened everyone's eyes to say, holy cow, this stuff is going on everywhere. We need to pay attention. And then you had the Biden executive order that says you have to use SBOM. And obviously the whole point of SBOM is really to just know what your open source is more than anything. And so I think it was just this perfect storm of events that all of a sudden everyone's paying attention and they're starting to ask the right questions, which is cool because, us old security nerds, we've been, for years and years, it's like, you need to pay attention to this stuff. And it's like, finally, we were right after 20 years.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, we had, obviously SolarWinds, the cybersecurity executive order, and Log4j right on the heels of that, and now everyone is paying attention.
Yeah,
I think what happened is not only like did they realize it was everywhere, they realized they didn't even know how to find out what they were using in many cases.
Yep.
Yeah,
yep, exactly.
So I want to ask you, like, coming off the hills of cybersecurity executive order and heavy-handed, maybe guidance coming out of NSA and SSDF from NIST and all these kind of things, like we're starting to see so much traction now on the topic. Any thoughts on how we kind of balance that dichotomy of guidance and best practices, but also, the creative, ecosystem that is open source software? Any thoughts on that front?
I have many thoughts on this front. So I think we're seeing in some circles this attitude of we have to fix open source. Like, open source isn't broken, and there's nothing you can do about it either, because we say open source, but it's not. Open source isn't a thing. It's like saying the forest, right? The forest is millions of trees. And when you think about it, you can think about it as this one big thing, but that doesn't always make sense because there's an enormous amount of like little things put together that kind of make open source what it is. So our ability to change and affect open source is very small. It's just not something you can do. It's like, try sweep away the ocean sort of idea. But I think this is where a lot of things like the SSDF and, you got SALSA and the EO and all this, the important part isn't to try to change open source. What it's really about is we need to understand what we're doing with it, right? Like we have this enormous natural resource in the world of computing. And so the question becomes like, what are you doing with it? How is it working? And so I think it's going to take a couple of years probably for a lot of this to shake out. But at the end, what's going to happen, because we can't fix open source. Well, it's not broke, but there's nothing we can do. So we're going to all have to grow up and learn. It's not about affecting open source. It's about understanding what I'm doing with it. And I think that's the direction a lot of this is pointing at. We're not quite there yet. We got some work to do, but fundamentally, that's what it's really going to come down to, is just knowing what am I doing with this stuff? And once I know what I have, now I can start making informed decisions.
Yeah, your comment there actually made me want to ask one more quick question of you before I kick it over to Nikki. You mentioned kind of like, what are we doing with this stuff? How are we governing it? I'm seeing more and more organizations, especially large enterprises, start to try to stand up an OSPO or an open source program office. Have you had any experience with that, or how do you see that playing out so far for organizations that are going down that path?
I mean, I know a bunch of folks who are working at OSPOs. I mean, it's generally large corporations, as you can imagine, that are doing this, but I feel like it's been very successful because it gives this large entity the ability to ask good questions and really gain an understanding of what's going on. Because I mean, open source, like anything new, there are known unknowns and unknown unknowns when you get into this situation. And I think having something like an OSPO where you bring in knowledgeable open source individuals, they can look at what's going on. They can help you make good decisions. I mean, one of my favorite examples is when you look at things like open source licensing. What are these things even doing? Like some of them, you have to give your product away or something. Like what is going on here? And so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in that space, and your open source program offices can help kind of lift that veil a little bit. And so I'd say, like, if you're a large organization and you have questions, like that's a great place to start, is finding knowledgeable people, and they can really, really make a big difference on what you're up to.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point about those program offices and just sort of bringing together SMEs, right? Like that's the only way that we learn, because we can't know
That's right.
everything.
That's right.
Well, I wanted to talking about the just sheer volume of podcasts that you have. You cover so many great topics, and one of the ones that you had recently that really caught my attention, and I felt like the topic was so relevant to open source software, but this idea of how open source can be unfair,
Yes.
whether that's to users, to developers. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective. So could you dive into that a little bit about sort of how you feel like it might be, sort of unfair?
Yeah, definitely. So the kind of the impetus of that topic was Microsoft put out a policy for their app store that said you can't sell open source software in the app store. And of course, the reason they did this is you had, we'll say, questionable ethics individuals were selling things like a Linux distribution for hundreds of dollars in their app store. And obviously, the intent was probably to trick people into accidentally installing the expensive thing instead of the free thing. Because, I mean, most of this stuff is free if you go look in the app store. And then, of course, you had a lot of people complaining and saying, oh, it's not fair that they're doing this. And this is, not the idea of open source and stuff. But kind of the reality is, again, we go back to my forest analogy, like, open source, it is what it is. Like you create this thing, you put a license on it, and then there might be a company could take your work and they could sell it for millions of dollars and give you nothing back. And is that fair? I mean, no, you can easily say it's not, but that's just the nature of the beast. And it does go both ways, where you can be someone using someone's open source and say, oh, there's a bug, or I need you to fix this thing. And they can say, I don't want to. Like, okay. I mean, I guess in that instance, you're getting it for free. So you could maybe argue it's more fair in that regard. But kind of this is, I think, one of those understanding aspects of open source, though, we are working on as just society and an industry of, there are weird things that happen in this space. Because I mean, fundamentally, open source was taking copyright and twisting it in ways it was never meant to be twisted with open source licenses. And so is it unfair? I mean, sometimes it's unfair, sometimes it's not. And I think also, though, this is where open source, there's a gentleman named Bruce Perens, who is one of kind of the creators of the open source concept and a lot of license work and things. And he actually has some speaking engagements recently where he's discussing things like the way we used to do open source doesn't always work today. And this unfairness is part of that. And he's talking about how to try to start bringing some equity and fairness to it, which it's complicated and it's hard. And like Bruce understands the challenge, but it's unfair. And it's a good title, right? It's a little clickbaity. So we were happy to go with that.
I wanted to ask you a quick question on that. Like you talked about the unfairness or expectations that maybe a consumer has of an open source software, project or maintainer. Do you think that despite the use of open source being pervasive across enterprises, some still don't understand exactly, how this works because they're expecting something from someone, even though they're not paying for it?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you see that all the time. There was one of my favorites was during the Log4Shell incident where there were companies sending security questionnaires to open source developers saying, "Can you fill this out?" And they're like, "No, I'm not filling this out. Like, you're using my stuff for free, And there's always going to be that, right? It doesn't matter how old open source becomes or what's going on. There's always going to be some level of misunderstanding, and that's okay. Now, I think one of the things that's a lot different, though, is in the early days, this 20 years ago, when there were misunderstandings, there was nothing we enjoyed more than making people cry for making a poor decision. And I think there's definitely a kinder side in many instances, because I think if you look at just the way people act, we've grown up a bit for one thing, but also there's some empathy there, which is good. But I mean, will there be misunderstandings? Absolutely. Will they go away? I think they're getting better, but they're never going to go away. And that's okay. I think it comes with both directions, though, right? If you're someone going out to open source, asking questions, like be humble and kind. And obviously, if you're an open source project, like don't yell at people. It's not nice.
I think that's a pretty good lesson probably across the industry, right?
Yeah.
It's like, let's have empathy and understanding for people first, and then,
That's right. That's
sort of
right.
understand. So I think that's great. Well, and sort of to pull on that a little bit, because, one of the things that you're touching on is sort of, this has been around for a long time. This has
Yeah.
been 20 years in the making. It's not
Yep.
something that happened overnight. And I think that one, we can learn a lot of really good, valuable lessons from the past. We can bring a lot of that knowledge with us, in sort of understanding where future trends might go or what's going on in the industry now, and sort of bringing some of those lessons forward. So can you talk a little bit about maybe even just from a year ago, maybe where some of our, where should we be concerned? Where should we be thinking about with open source? I know there's a lot of work around SBOM and all of that, but
Yep.
do you think that there's some other trends or things that we should be concerned about with open source?
I mean, I think the biggest trend I see at the moment is the fact that people are figuring it out. Where, I mean, my favorite example is, so I've been at Anchor a year now. I spent 4 years at Elastic and a decade at Red Hat before that. And when I came to Anchor, it was very much an uphill battle just explaining what an SBOM is, right? Because SBOM it's fairly new, maybe 3 or 4 years, give or take. It's a lot older than that, but we'll say 3 or 4 years has kind of been like the real meat of SBOM getting attention. And a year ago, there was a lot of like, I don't even know what this is. Why do I want this? And now, and I think Log4Shell was part of this, as well as just many other happenings in the industry. But now people know what they are, and they're saying like, we need this, we need to work with this, like, please help us. And that's a much nicer conversation than starting from zero and saying kind of what's going on. And so I think from a year, I would say just the fact that people are starting to recognize, I have to know what I'm running, I have to understand what this is. That's always the first step, right? And this is true if you look at kind of the way we used to look at logs, the way we looked at observability data, the way we looked at monitoring data. There's this certain evolution. And so now what happens is, now that we can start saying things like, I understand what I'm looking at, we can start asking new questions that we have the data. And that's what makes me really excited, because today we're mostly using this data for vulnerability scanning, essentially, of saying, are there any vulnerabilities in what I have? Or you can ask the question, do I have Log4Shell anywhere in my infrastructure? Which, I mean, those are great problems, but there's going to be, I think, so much exciting new technology and ideas that come out of all this, because now we're getting the data and we can start to invent the future. And I don't know what it is yet, which is frustrating to me sometimes, because I'm like, I can feel there's something coming, but I don't know what it is. But I have a lot of expectations that in the next like 3 or 4 years, we're going to look back at now and be like, holy cow, we were dumb and annoying. Look at what we've accomplished.
Yeah, actually, I was going to save the SBOM question for a little bit later, but you guys dove into it. So now I'm going to open the can of worms and keep going with you guys. I've seen the same thing where like it's shifted to like, what is an SBOM? Why do I even need this? To now it's okay. Like, well, now what do I do with this?
Yeah.
I think we have a gap between like having the SBOM, but like actually operationalizing it as part of like a vulnerability management program and ingesting and automating the ingestion and creation and things like that. Any thoughts, like if you did have to take a guess of where it is going in a few years, like how do we mature this in terms of tools and technologies and processes?
Yeah. I mean, so there's the CISO, used to be NTIA. CISA is doing a lot of this work now with SBOM. Dr. Alan Friedman is the gentleman behind much of it, which he's a lovely person. And they've had many kind of meetings and listening sessions and working groups they put together. And today, kind of the underlying theme is, okay, I need to get SBOMs. Like, how do I make these things in a way that makes sense? Because like something no one realizes is, so we talk about, oh, you need an SBOM, but what does that even mean? Do I need an SBOM of my source code? Do I need an SBOM of my build system? Do I need an SBOM of the container I'm deploying? Do I need an SBOM of my infrastructure I'm deploying into? And so you think about this and it's like, holy cow, there's a lot more going on here than just saying, oh, I need an SBOM. Like all problems though, right? It's kind of you solve that first problem and you peel it back and you're like, holy cow, there's 10 new problems under here. What do I do now? And that's fine though, because that's just the nature of the industry. So we're collecting all this data. Now, first of all, we need somewhere to put it because there aren't a lot of places to put SBOMs today. I mean, they're JSON documents. You can stick them in, a document storage system or whatever. And that's fine for now, but it also makes it harder to start mining the data and asking the good questions, right? So we've got obviously vulnerability management is an easy one today. There's what am I running is an easy one today. But then I think some of the more interesting things I'm seeing come out of this is stuff like, okay, so I've got a container in my infrastructure, right? I'm using Kubernetes. And there's this thing called a Kubernetes admission controller, where you can basically have Kubernetes reach out to something and say, should I run this container? That's really cool because now you can look at things like vulnerabilities. You can look at things like packages in it. You can ask questions about the licenses you're using. And so now you have a system that can say, hold on, you can't deploy this for some reason, right? You can set your policy and decide what that means. And so that's really exciting, I think, of having the ability to control some of our infrastructure, because let's face it, most of us couldn't tell you what we're running if we had to. And that's just the nature of the beast. It's always been that way. I think it's getting better. Hopefully it gets a lot better. But I think that's kind of the next step, I think, is going to be starting to understand what we have and maybe apply some policy and controls to that. But then I think further down the road is when we can start asking more questions about, like, what am I running? For example, in the open source universe, do you have a package that hasn't been updated in 7 years? Right? I mean, anytime I go out and look for a piece of open source to solve a problem I have, the first thing I do is I go to their GitHub and I look at when was the last commit. And if the last commit was 10 years ago, I'm like, I am not using this piece of open source because it's clear it's abandoned, right? But we don't always have that answer today. So we can start asking questions like that, like, is this abandoned, right? We can ask questions like, how many security updates has this thing gotten? If it's 0, like, people are always saying, oh, it's had like 300 security updates. That's bad. Well, yes, that's bad. And 0 is also bad because nothing is free of security vulnerabilities. And so I think this is where we can start using the data to ask more interesting questions. And we can, again, I'm not saying we have to change open source. We have to change how we use the open source. And I think that's some of the opportunities I see, is our ability to start mining the data, asking weird questions, and getting the kind of answers we want. Because fundamentally, at the end of the day, all of this stuff we're doing, right? We have a business. We have to take on a certain amount of risk to run our business. And we want to make sure that the risk we're taking on isn't unacceptably high. And I think in some instances, we can't answer that question. I think we've lucked out a lot because open source is awesome and it does what it's supposed to do. But as it ages, I think there's good, like, it's 10 years it hasn't seen an update today. It's going to be 20 years in 10 years. You know what I mean? And now it's like, holy cow, what are we doing with this stuff?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment before Chris's next question, because I think that one of the fundamental, areas that we sort of work in vulnerability management is that it is highly complex. There are a lot of factors, and that really plays into those risk management decisions. And so I think the idea of better visibility, that always helps to inform risk. And your note about, we're never going to be vulnerability free, but if at least we understand what we have, that's the biggest piece of the puzzle. And then we can make risk informed decisions from there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I like where you were going with the security update piece is, people lose the nuance of thinking that, it has a lot of security updates as if that's a bad thing. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe they're actually paying attention and fixing things. That's a good sign,
There's
right?
a line, I think, right?
Yeah.
Because the joke we used to have back in the early days was there was this piece of software called Flash Player, and Flash Player would have like 30 security vulnerabilities a month, it felt like, because
It sure did.
it
Yep.
was it was a poorly written, okay, I should, that's mean. It was a piece of software from a different time where you didn't worry about attacks. You didn't have to deal with all the kind of security problems we had. And then the world changed. Real Player didn't. And thank goodness it's gone now. But
Yeah, I want to ask you another question. Like, you talked about, I love the use cases, by the way. You went, kind of beyond the initial, like, here's a vulnerability to understanding, like, admission controllers for workloads and,
yep,
cloud native architecture, and also maybe procurement and acquisition informing decisions on that front,
yep.
So I want to ask you, like, another concept really related to the SBOM is, VEX is actually understanding, like, not only is there a vulnerability,
Yes.
but is it exploitable? What are your thoughts on that front? And do you think that'll help bring some clarity to the noise of just drowning in vulnerability data?
Absolutely. I love VEX. So VEX stands for Vulnerability Exchange. It's part of the CISA SBOM crew, has been working on this for, oh geez, it's been a couple of years now, I think. And VEX is very near and dear to my heart because I learned about it from Alan Friedman. And the reason I got involved is when I was at Elastic, I had independently invented VEX, and I used the exact same terminology they were even using, which I laughed out loud when I saw that. Which, I mean, it's also a small industry. There's only so many ways to explain this. But the basic idea is, so I have a piece of software, and if I scan it for vulnerabilities, I'm going to get a very long list. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And some of the things on that list don't affect me for a variety of reasons. It could be an actual false positive where I know the scanner's doing something weird. It could be I have this open source dependency, but I'm not actually using it in a way that's vulnerable. It could be I know this code is bad, but I'm not using it in the way that it's vulnerable necessarily. And so there's all these reasons that you might not be affected by a security vulnerability. And let's say you have a reasonably sized piece of software. Let's say you have 300 or 400 findings, which is not unreasonable, and you have a limited amount of time. And so you obviously want to fix the things that affect you first and then get to the other stuff. And Vex is a way that I can create a document, a machine readable document, and say, give it to my customers and say, here's my Vex statement. Like, I know about these vulnerability findings you're going to see in the scanner, and they don't affect me for this reason. And the idea then being, I'm working on the stuff that does affect me. Like, I will get to this stuff someday, but not yet. And the reason that's important is you might scan something and it could have critical findings. And so you're freaking out because it's like, oh my goodness, this product has, 15 critical CVEs. But the reality is it doesn't, because I'm not using that functionality. So I know it's a way of just saying, I know it's there. Leave me alone. I'm going to fix it, just not yet. And it's great though.
Yeah, I love this, adding more context around vulnerability scoring and understanding what those vulnerabilities mean, because it is really context driven.
Yeah.
Just because it has a score doesn't necessarily mean that that score is applicable in every
That's
situation
right.
and to
That's
every
right.
environment. And so I love this idea of one, adding more context, and that in turn helps making prioritization, remediation, administrative overhead. It helps
Yep.
solve so many problems
Absolutely.
by adding context.
Yep.
I,
Yep.
I I wanted to ask you real quick, Josh. I have a question for you about the global security database and stuff. But I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you, given we're talking about contextualization of vulnerabilities and exploitability, what are your thoughts on EPSS? We actually have a comment in the chat about EPSS and trying to add the exploitability factor to vulnerabilities and CVEs. And I think you probably have some pretty unique, interesting perspective on that too.
I love EPSS. I think from my limited view, now mind you, it's still new-ish. We'll say the idea behind EPSS is a way to try to measure, like, how, what do I say? It's like it's not black and white. It's meant to be like, I think there's a possibility this will be an exploited vulnerability, is the idea. And I think it's more realistic where it's kind of a sliding scale of probably not to probably, versus I think in security, a lot of times we try to apply this very black and white view to things. And so the intent of EPSS is a way of just saying, I'm looking at all of this data about a particular vulnerability, and I'm going to use this data to make a determination of if I think it's going to be exploited. Because at the end of the day, like, you can have critical issues that never get exploited. Is it really critical? And you can have low issues that do get exploited. Well, that's pretty freaking critical, I'd say, you know? And I think this is kind of what the job of EPSS is meant to do. And so I am very optimistic that EPSS is really the future of scoring vulnerabilities, more so than the current CVSS, which is much more kind of black and white and rigid, but it also doesn't work particularly well. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I agree with you there. We actually had an individual named Jax Chester on, who wrote a really lengthy kind of a rebuke. I don't say rebuke, but a really critical review of CVSS, and we kind of dove into that with him.
That's a great piece. Jacques did a wonderful job on that. And it's funny because I wrote something kind of similar a couple of years ago, but I was really lazy and I took the lame way out, and like, he did it right, and it was amazing.
Yeah, he took a deep dive, and I had to like read it twice to make sure I even like understood everything he was saying.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you as well, like, I know you have some really in-depth experience with CVE and NVD, for example.
Yep.
And you and Kurt actually kind of spearheaded an effort with Cloud Security Alliance to establish what's known as the Global Security Database, if I'm not mistaken. So you can tell us a bit about what is GSD and why do we need it?
Yeah, I would love to. So the GSD stands for Global Security Database, and the intent behind this, we're working with the Cloud Security Alliance. I mean, these things need to live in kind of some sort of foundation. And the intent is that we have existing vulnerability data, and it's not very good. It's very human focused. Like, if you look at the CVE data, there's not a lot of good machine readable data there. The description is prose. And what happens is there's the CVE project kind of puts this data into their data set, and then NVD takes it and they do their best to interpret the prose description to add things like CPE names and CVSS scores. And they get it wrong a lot. I mean, and everyone knows that. But then as a consumer, if I identify errors in this data, there's really very little I can do about that. And there's no good way to update the data. It's very difficult to communicate back to NVD or CVE about what's going on. And so the idea behind the GSD was to start trying to create a community of people who have the ability to like understand what's going on, enrich data with things for machines. Because let's face it, like, humans, there's too much data already for humans to understand, and there's a lot we're missing. One of my favorite examples is if you search GitHub for buffer overflow, there's like 9 million issues, right? We have a total of 200,000 CVEs ever, and there's 9 million buffer overflow issues in GitHub. Like, there's probably a lot of security vulnerabilities we're missing. And the problem is we just can't add more right now because we're already like creaking at the seams of trying to deal with our current volume. So the idea is GSD wants to make this all as machine readable as possible. Like we keep saying over and over again, like, no humans, right? We don't want humans looking at this stuff. We don't want humans touching this stuff. We want robots having the ability to figure out what's going on and then make good decisions with good data. And it's a hard project. There's a long way to go. But I think just kind of for the moment, our intent is to start building out some structure so anyone can help enrich the data and make it better. Because I mean, the idea is very open source of if you look historically at open source, people would say, oh, anyone can contribute. And like that actually turned out to be the superpower. And I think in vulnerability data, it's similar now where people are saying, oh, but anyone can contribute. How could we trust them? It's like, how can we trust you? Like, have you seen the data? And so we think there's power in kind of bringing this down from the mountaintop and letting the humans get involved and work on it. And the idea is hopefully if we can improve the data and solve some of these weird problems, we won't even need humans at all, where it'll just be machine readable from start to finish. And like, that's the dream. But I also know we are a long, long way from that dream.
Yeah, I wanted to this takes me perfectly into my my next question for you, because this idea that I see how open source software in the vulnerability sort of context, like what we're talking about here, but also in when we're talking about mental workloads and the amount of information that we have to process on a daily basis, and not just with open source, right? Because that's just one piece of everything that we do. And I was curious because, you know, you're sort of mentioning this idea of how do we sort of remove humans from the equation of the data analysis component. Do you feel like there's some other ways that open source and understanding vulnerabilities, we can help the humans that need to sort of make these really good decisions. Do you think that there's some other ways that open source is sort of helping that? Because I see that there are potential benefits, maybe some concerns there, but potential benefits for helping to, alleviate some of those workloads off of us.
I mean, I think there's some things going on that are making it better. My favorite right now is GitHub actually has like security advisories they've built into the platform. So if you're an open source project, you can publish a security advisory, for example, and it's very machine friendly. And I think like that's a great example of where the open source universe can kind of do some things to help. We're seeing projects like Go and Python and NPM are starting to create their own machine readable content. But now one of the downfalls to that, though, is now when you have 30 projects each doing their own thing, now you have to try to figure out how do we track 30 projects. And like this is another thing that GSD hopes to help with is we can maybe aggregate some of this and bring it to one place instead of having to go figure out what's going on with everybody. But I think from my perspective, everyone knows this is important. We just don't quite know what to do about it yet. And that's also very open source, though, of let's try 100 things and we're going to pick the ones that work and we like. And that's just how the game is played. And that's okay. But it's also cool because there's nothing more infuriating to me when they say, oh, no, this is the way we're going to do it. It's like, wait, what? No, that's not how this works. And I think sometimes, especially in industry, we can see that we're like the big, the industry body that's driving the bus gets to tell us what to do. And it's not always the best way. So I'm very approving of using open source to solve some of this.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, so that's going to take me to our last question. And I'm really interested in your perspective on this, which is what does cyber resiliency mean to you?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, from my perspective, and again, I'm old, so I've been doing this for a long time. I think the important part of kind of resiliency is not the black and white view we've had in the past. Because when I started in this industry, it was a very you're secure, you're not secure. If you're not secure, you're dumb, and we're going to yell at you. Whereas now, I think we're really starting to understand that resiliency is kind of just a way to measure and understand risk. You can't control risk necessarily. There's things you can do that can maybe, push the needle in one direction or another. But fundamentally, it's more about just getting all this data and understanding. This is the one thing I'm super thankful of for spending my tenure at Elastic is I learned to recognize how valuable data can be when you use it correctly. Because prior to my time at Elastic, I was like, oh, data, what are we going to do with this? And now, like anytime I have a question, I go find some data, I stick it in Elasticsearch and I start asking questions. And you find out amazing and bizarre things sometimes, and that's okay. But I think that's the key is we all have risk. You will never have zero risk. Like zero risk means zero reward, right? That's not why any of us are here. We're all here because we're looking for our reward. And so it's really about just understanding, like that's the first step. You don't have to even worry about what's going on after that. Just know what you have. And then you can start making plans for what that means. And so just from a resilient perspective, it's really about like, let's just a little less risk every day. And before you know it, you've made a difference.
Yeah, I love that answer. Before I take us out, for our audience, can you tell them where to find you, what you're working on, all that good stuff that you're doing?
I'm working on many things. So I'm on Twitter at Josh Bressers. That's where you'll probably find links to all of the good stuff. There's the open source security podcast.com oh man, usually when I say that, it's followed by a bunch of outro. That was weird. Then there's hacker history. You could just type all this stuff into Google. And then I like to write. I like to do, conference talks whenever possible, stuff like this, a podcast. I absolutely adore talking about security. So by all means, like get in touch. Let me know your thoughts. I love talking to people about this stuff. It's not just something I do for work. It's my true passion. And so it's kind of one of those situations where I know everyone always says, oh, don't never make your hobby your job. But in my case, I kind of did. And I love it. I love it all.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Josh, for joining us today. That's going to take us out for this week, and we'll see everybody next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.